You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Disease du Jour podcast. I'm your host, Carly Sisson, and in this episode I spoke with Dr. Jennifer Groon about importing horses to the United States. The Disease du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health. Dr. Groon graduated from the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine in 2006 and went on to complete a 2-year course of study under the guidance of Dr. Stuart Brown, investigating the use of anabolic steroids at Keeneland sales grounds. She was a member of the Hagyard Equine Medical Group in Lexington, Kentucky for 7 years. During her time at Hagyard, she gained extensive experience in thoroughbred reproductive management, field medicine, and sales of thoroughbred yearlings and 2-year-olds in training. She also served as the in-flight veterinarian for horses traveling overseas. Dr. Groon began working at the Mid-Atlantic Equine Medical Center in 2013. Her primary focus is equine sports medicine. She served as the head of quarantine and as a USCF FBI veterinary apprentice for eventing at the 2007 Beijing Welcome Games test event and the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. In 2010, Dr. Groon, along with the USCA and the Office of the State Veterinarian, headed up the quarantine and the quarantine facility located at the Northern Kentucky Cincinnati Airport for the Alltech FBI World Equestrian Games. She has since built a successful sport horse practice, the Finer Equine, where she splits her time between central New Jersey and Wellington, Florida. Dr. Groon enjoys taking part in the entire equine life process. She is passionate about the challenge of breaking young thoroughbreds and taking them to the track, or taking racehorses that have been retired and giving them a new career as 3-day event horses. In her free time, she actively competes her horses through intermediate level, runs marathons, and is involved in the local pony clubs. Thank you, Dr. Groon, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about this with you. I know you have a lot of experience with importing horses. Can you explain some of the testing you recommend buyers perform prior to purchasing or importing a horse from Europe?
Sure. So I think it's really important that veterinarians tell their clients that before they fall in love with a horse and spend the money on a pre-purchase, that they at least do some prior blood testing, especially from Europe. You need to do a Dorine, a glanders, and a pyroplasmosis for geldings. And then mares and stallions also need a CEM swab. Otherwise, you can do the whole pre-purchase, spend all that money, and then the horses can't be imported. So I think it's important. I didn't know when I started importing horses for myself that needed to be done. And luckily, I had a friend to help me through it. And it's just something that's good to know. They will pull those bloods at the time of your pre-purchase, but you've already spent the money on the pre-purchase. So you might as well do the blood work before you even get invested in a pre-purchase. I mean, you're going to be spending $2,000 at least on your pre-purchase. So just do the bloods first. That'll cost you maybe $150, but it's certainly worth doing before you spend a couple thousand, and find out the horse can't be imported.
Right. That's a great point. Can you walk us through the process of flying a horse overseas? I know that you used to work as an in-flight veterinarian, so can you explain that role a little bit and some of the challenges you might encounter?
Yeah. So first of all, flying horses, it is such a cool experience. There's 2 different ways to do it. One is where they take all the horses, they walk them up the ramp, onto the plane, actually walking them, and then they build stalls around them, and you have about 50 horses on the plane, and they all fly over. And they take a couple of stops. We used to fly horses from Kentucky all the time, the thoroughbreds after the sales, these yearlings. And we'd stop in Ireland, and we'd stop in France, and then we'd stop in England and drop horses off along the way. And horses fly so well. It's like a van ride without the starts and stops. So the only part they don't really like is the takeoff and the bump on the landing, but they fly really well. So that's one way. It's all on, all aboard, and 50 horses. And then the other way, which is what they do more of now, is they put the horses on in these little air stalls. There's 2 or 3 across, and they put each individual stall, they load them up on these big FedEx planes or Air France planes, these big cargo planes. And that's flying in style. The horses fly just as well, but they have their own little individual air stall, and the horse behind isn't trying to bite the horse in front, and it's much more civilized. But flying horses is an adventure, but I'm scared to fly myself. And I found that flying horses is is really not scary at all. And they're very calm. I could tell you some stories about flying these horses on planes that, I mean, they're just something else. They freeze the plane. I don't know if you knew that at all. They make it really cold. So even if it's like the middle of summer, you get on the plane and you have your coveralls on and a winter jacket and a baklava thing that goes over your nose and a hat, and you sleep in a sleeping bag, and that really quiets the horses down. They fly much better like that. And the only problem is when you land and the plane thaws, you get rained on by like all the humidity that was in the air that the horses have breathed out, and all the dengue or hay or whatever has gone up in the air and is now raining on you. So that's definitely an experience.
That's so interesting. I didn't know about freezing the plane, but I imagine that makes it way more comfortable for the horses. What is the veterinarian's responsibility when you're flying with the horse? Is it to make sure that if something happens in the air, that there's someone there who can manage it?
Well, yeah. So for those planes where they walk them all on individually, I mean, the stalls are just like little standing stalls, just a piece of plywood in between each horse. And sometimes when you take off, like they don't really like that, so they'll try to jump out. So your main job is to sedate horses. I'd say like that's 90% of what you do. And before you even like take off, you like fill all your syringes, and you're ready to go, because you don't have much time to get to a horse to sedate it as it's trying to jump out of its stall on a plane. And a funny story about that is one time we were flying horses. I think it was either like a intern or a super intern. I got my syringes all ready, and I pulled up my Dermosidan, and I gave the most expensive horse on the plane. It was a yearling, like 0.5 or 0.6 of Dermosidan. And I thought it was going to die. I mean, it is hanging over the front of the plane, like cutting off its airway. So I'm holding it up, and I learned that Dermosidan takes exactly 45 minutes at 0.5 or 0.6 dose to get out of their system so that they can lift their head up again. But mostly your job is just to keep the horses calm and safe. And sometimes they'll get little lacerations, which you're just triaging. Like sometimes you sew them up on the plane. Sometimes you just kind of dress them so you can sew them up when the plane lands. Every once in a while, you'll have a colic on a plane. And again, it's just triage. Sometimes we run fluids, give Banamine, but there's not much you can do because there's not much in the way of being able to actually get to the horse. And sometimes you have ones that are just like kickers, and you're just trying to keep them from hurting themselves and hurting their buddy that's standing right next to them. So I'd say sedation is your number one job on a plane. And the flying grooms that fly with these horses are incredible. They tell you what you need to do and where you need to be and what horse needs to be sedated, but you just have to be able to hit a vein and do it well. And then they like you, and you get to keep flying horses. It's fun.
Today's Disease Du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health's Protozil 1.56% diclazerol anti-protozoal pellets. Get the scoop on Protozil easy-to-administer top dress alfalfa pellets. A safe and effective treatment that starts working fast without a loading dose. Learn more at merckanimalhealthusa.com. Do not use Protozil in horses with known hypersensitivity to diclazerol. Safety has not been studied in breeding, pregnant, or lactating horses. For complete safety information, please read label. Is there any sort of process for being qualified to be an in-flight veterinarian? I imagine if you're crossing international borders, it might conflict with some regulations by the country. So what was the process like for you to get that role?
Really, all I had to do was be licensed in the States. And then I was allowed to treat the horses on the plane and when we offloaded. But other than that, I didn't do any sort of veterinary work. So just a license and a passport. That's all I needed.
Really fascinating job option. So I guess going back to importing horses, what does the quarantine process look like for horses arriving in the US from Europe? And can you briefly explain the duration and the types of infectious diseases that horses will be screened for?
Sure. So when they get off the plane, they spend 72 hours in whatever port they land in. And for us on the East Coast, it's usually Miami or it is Newburgh in New York. And after that time, if it's a gelding, it can go wherever it needs to go. And if it's a mare or a stallion, it then spends 21 days at a quarantine facility, and then they get swabbed for CEM. They get packed with furacin, and they get swabbed 3 separate times. And then after that time, they're allowed to go wherever they need to go. And at these import facilities, I mean, they're riding facilities. You can ride your horses. You take care of your own horses. They have like little turnouts and stuff, but you cannot give them any sort of antibiotics. You can give them anti-inflammatories, Banamine, Bute, fine, but no antibiotics. And that goes for creams or sweats or antimicrobial shampoos. In fact, I don't think you can really use much of any sort of shampoo. They really want to make sure that if there is CEM, they're finding it and they're treating it appropriately so we don't get it in the States. So that's important because some of these horses, they get cellulitis because they've never been here before. They have allergies, they get respiratory disease, and our hands are really tied as far as what we can do. I had a horse that flew in from Europe a couple weeks ago, and it flew in. It had shipping fever, and it had a fever of 104.5 at the quarantine facility. It was a gelding, so it only had to be there for 72 hours, but it couldn't make it. It was colicking and just really sick. So then in those cases, those horses have to go to a hospital that has a quarantine set up. And let me tell you, that is very expensive. That is going to be a huge cost for your client. I think for my clients, it was almost $15,000 or $20,000, and the horse was there for maybe a week. It ended up with pneumonia. But I mean, those clinics have to have like a quarantine facility, and they have to go through all the protocols, and the USDA gets involved. So clients need to know that if they do end up in the hospital because you can't take care of them at the quarantine facility, it's going to be expensive. The other thing about these quarantine facilities that it's important to know is that they usually have hours. And after 4 o'clock generally is the time, you cannot go into that quarantine facility, even as a veterinarian, to check on a horse without paying a fee. So the ones that I've seen, they're like $500 just to go in and take a look at the horse if it's sick or colicky. So I thought that was interesting and very frustrating, actually.
That is really interesting. You don't really hear about that too often. I know everyone always budgets for the costs of importing the horse and quarantining them if everything goes well, but they might not be super familiar with what they're in for if everything doesn't go well with the quarantine process. So really good point there. What are some health issues you commonly encounter in horses that have been imported from Europe?
Well, I think shipping fever is a big one that we see. I mean, it just happens with the stress. A lot of skin conditions because they're not used to, our pollens, the dirt. Sometimes in Florida, when we import them in Florida, the sand, they get a lot of skin disease. And then EPM, we screen all of our horses for EPM as soon as they come out of quarantine. So either the 72 hours for the geldings or longer for the mares and stallions. But every single one that comes out of quarantine, we do our own Coggins so that we have it in our records, because they do like something just to get into the country, but that Coggins cannot be used afterwards. Like it cannot be used for shows. It cannot be used to travel once it gets to your farm. So you have to make sure you pull your own Coggins. So EIA, EPM, we pull for everybody, and we do a fecal. And then we also vaccinate them because these horses have not had any vaccination for rabies, for botulism. Most of them have had flu and rhino because that's FEI rules and USCF rules worldwide. For botulism and rabies, it's a must give.
So do you have any insight on why these horses are testing positive for EPM? Is that a common issue in Europe, or is it something that doesn't really exist there and doesn't make a lot of sense for these horses to have?
So these horses are totally naive. They should be anyway. And that's what we thought for a long time. They don't have EPM in Europe. It's definitely an American disease. And we're seeing a lot of these horses that come out of quarantine that are positive for EPM. So either they're exposed in quarantine and they don't need a lot of exposure because they're naive to actually have a very high positive titer, because the ones here, they see it, but it's like a low dose, so their immune system takes care of it. No big deal. They've seen it before. But these naive horses, they've never seen it before. So, I mean, it is a bigger deal. Our titers are really high. So either they're getting it in quarantine, which is definitely a possibility, or they're getting exposed to something in Europe. And we don't think they have sarcocystitis or Neospora in Europe, but maybe Dr. Pastrola was thinking that maybe there's toxoplasmosis, and we're getting a little bit of like cross-referencing with that in our EPM testing here. So I mean, I think that's interesting. I don't know how much research they've done on that, but it was something that's kind of been brought up, and it's interesting because we do test every single one of them, and quite a few are positive for EPM.
That's really interesting. And it'll be interesting to see if research progresses on that in the future. What other types of veterinary work do you like to perform on horses once they're out of quarantine?
I think not necessarily a standard thing, but I think your client has a relationship with you. I think it's really important to do it once over on this horse, a full lameness, because they're getting a pre-purchase done by someone who is absolutely not vested in them. They don't have a relationship with them. They're just telling you if the horse really has 4 legs and a tail, I find. And I think it's important to take your own radiographs, because the views that we take here are a little different unless you ask for specific views in Europe. And there are very many like excellent veterinarians in Europe. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we take our views. When you take x-rays for your buyer, the person who now owns this horse, you are very interested in exactly what the horse has, not trying to say like, oh, it's just a little fuzzy, it's no big deal. Like, you really want to know, like, what's his hock look like? Is there really a little chip in the ankle? What do the naviculars actually look like? Because they don't like to take navicular skylines, or they just don't take navicular skylines. So I think that's important. Everyone takes necks and backs now, so that's great. But I do think it's nice to get a full set of radiographs. And the other thing is, when they send their radiographs, if you have that done in Europe, that link expires in 30 days. So if your buyer doesn't save those radiographs, doesn't actually download them, then in 30 days that link's expired. And if they bought it through someone else, through a seller, and that actually wasn't their radiographs, you cannot get to them. So I think it's important to take your own radiographs, to do just a basic lameness on this horse and see where you are, to do an EPM, to do a Coggins, and just kind of like get a baseline. Because we're seeing a lot of neurologic horses here. And it's like, it's nice to know, like, did it come here like that? Did it get an EPM here? Is it young and now it's just kind of developing into a neurologic thing? It's just nice to have your own baseline and something that you're comfortable with and your clients are comfortable with you.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Just having like a general idea of where you're at when the horse arrives is probably really helpful for long-term management of that client. Is there anything else you'd like to add on the topic of importation before we wrap up?
I do wish that more clients realized that, it means so much to be able to try a horse and actually ride it. I've imported 2 horses myself, and one, I even had a friend of mine do the vetting for me, but I got the horse all the way over here and I spent the most money I've ever spent on a horse in my life. And I ended up donating her because I couldn't ride her. And the other one is probably one of the nicest horses I've ever owned, but the meanest horse I've ever had, neither of which I actually went over and tried myself and just had pre-purchased. So I do think there's something to be said for actually trying these horses. I saw something on Facebook today that was like, oh, American horses are so overpriced. Go to Europe and you'll get a deal. Like, yes, they're more expensive here, but the money that you spend importing these horses, dealing with the problems that they may or may not have once they land here, sometimes it's worth paying a little extra money. You get to ride them, you get to try them, you get to actually see them and touch them and have your own veterinarian do the pre-purchase that really is invested in you and your best interests. I do think there's something to be said for buying horses here and not importing. Importing is super fun though. I mean, it is fun. It's a little bit of a risk, and which makes it more exciting, but there are a lot of risks. And I've seen a lot of people spend a lot of money on a cheap horse and it's just money thrown away. So I think it's something that you have to educate your clients on, because it can be really heartbreaking when you get a horse here that just not what you think it was.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Groon, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for listening. And a very special thank you to our sponsor, Merck Animal Health. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, please send me an email at csisson@equinenetwork.com. That's CSISSON@equinenetwork.com.